Please welcome to the stage the IOP Executive Director, Zima Rahman.
Good morning, everybody. I'm glad to see all my bright, chirpy students in the front row. If this is your first day, welcome to the University of Chicago, the Institute of Politics, and the Bridging the Divide Conference. We kicked off the conference yesterday with a really fantastic conversation on narrative, how others see us, but I think more importantly, like how we see ourselves and how we see ourselves reflected in various spaces. Today is, you can kind of think of as the whole enchilada in a sense. We are covering it all. We're going to kick off with a high-level panel on the interdependencies between various communities. And then we're going to look at a range of policy issues, everything from the mental health loneliness epidemic to news deserts. And we're ending the day with one of the most important things that connect us, which is our food supply and our food chain. I wanted to tell you that our working internal title for this conference was not Bridging the Divide. There was some conversation about, is this the right title and what divides are we bridging and all of that stuff. Our working title internally at IOP was Interconnected. And so if I have homework to give you guys, it's be interconnected today. And what I mean by that is we have so many people in this room that represent so many different spaces and places around the rural and urban issues that I want you to get to know one another. So I would love you to just identify in a way who you are. So if you're a student who's not from University of Chicago, if you're one of our visiting student delegations, can you please stand? So we have students from 20 different schools and colleges and universities from across the country. And those of you who've done Bridging the Divide, the program that we've run for the last 5 years, can you stay standing and the rest of you can sit down? So we have, I know that you're here, but and then there you go, thank you. Can our University of Chicago students stand? These are your hosts today, so find them, ask them questions, ask them anything you want about Chicago, etc. If you're University of Chicago IOP adjacent, can you stand? There we go. Our sister Simone Campbell, our fellow this year. And if you're a journalist, somebody in the media, could you stand? Wonderful. Welcome, welcome. If you're in the social sector, which is philanthropy, nonprofits, creative industry, artist, can you stand? A lot of us from the social sector, that's fantastic. And then I would say business, if you're business, private industry, if you could please stand. Okay, well, that's maybe something we need to work on. So I want you, the homework is, please find somebody from an industry or sector that's not yours, from a college that's not yours, say hello, make friends. It's kind of the point of this whole thing is that we end this being more connected than we started. Have a wonderful day. Like I said, it's a meaty day. There are opportunities through lunch for breakout sessions. Please keep your badge on at all times. We're being really diligent about the badge wearing. I'm trying to think of the other logistics I had to say to you. Yes?
You forgot government.
Government. Well, yeah, you're right. You're right. Government, please stand up. How could I forget government when I'm the Institute of Politics? Anyway, enjoy the day. Oh, this is what I wanted to say. I just want to thank our sponsors, who are Christy Walton, an alum of the university who sponsored, Christy Walton is not, an alum of the university named Ray Iwanowski, who sponsors the Democracy Innovation Fund, and the Allstate Company. Without their support, we wouldn't have been able to do this. So have a wonderful day, meet one another, and I'm pleased to kick off the day. Thank you, everybody.
Please welcome our first panel, We Need Each Other, Urban-Rural Interdependence, with United States Deputy Ag Secretary Xochitl Torres Small, former Arizona Governor Doug Ducey, Tony Pipa, Senior Fellow of Global Economy and Development in the Center for Sustainable Development at the Brookings Institution. This conversation will be moderated by IOP Director and former United States Senator Heidi Heitkamp.
Good morning. Thank you all for coming. What a great group we have, and I hope that this panel will kick it off and set the stage for what we hope to do during the entire day. And so I can't thank you three enough. You have three incredible leaders on this stage. One who has been studying rural economics for decades, and we'll get into that a little bit. One who represented one of the most rural areas in the United States. I think if your district was a state, it'd be way bigger than like the whole Northeast, right? In New Mexico, the deputy secretary, and then of course, someone who represents to me one of the most interesting urban-rural states. When you think of Phoenix as one of the fastest growing metropolitan areas, but you get outside of Phoenix, those of us who have traveled to Arizona, it's beautiful territory, but it is rural America. And so what we hope to do is get some ideas and listen to lessons learned about how do you bridge those challenges in each one of those spaces. But I want to start out first with Tony, and because to kind of set the stage, first I'd love to hear why you chose this as your academic pursuit, as your intellectual pursuit, and then what about your work over how many decades that you've been looking at this? What about your work do you think is least understood in America?
Well, thanks, Heidi, and thanks to you and the University of Chicago and the Institute of Politics for actually having us here. I mean, this is just such an exciting event to be part of, and I'm really pleased to be here. So I'm a small town boy from Pennsylvania, north central Pennsylvania. I grew up in a town of 1,800. And it was a town that was thriving then, and it's thriving today. But I also went to elementary school in a town about 7 miles away, which in rural America is nothing. And it's a town that now has fallen into persistent poverty. Poverty is above 30%. And it's really seen a decline, loss of population, but also just a loss of the things that make a community, a town, a community, like a home. And I think that's one of the things that's really drawn me to this particular work is that, rural America, if you look at the aggregate economics, there's been some economic divergence. Unemployment and labor rate participation still isn't back to where it was even pre-2008 recession. And in urban and suburban areas, it's not only recovered, but it's grown even after the pandemic. But there's also a lot happening that's positive in rural America, and rural America is also the place where we have the most acute labor shortages, for example, as well. So there's this mixed picture, and it's very diverse, and I hope we talk about that diversity today. But even amidst that diversity and that diversity of economics, I think rural America has felt a lot of pressure on the institutions and the civic structures that really make a place vibrant and vital and sustained over time. And so even in those places that are doing well, you still see a loss of bank branches or a loss of local news or, the library being under pressure. Hospitals, rural hospitals, we're seeing a lot of loss of rural hospitals and rural healthcare. And I have a part of my career that was in international development in the federal government as well. And I saw how we made investments overseas that took the nod from local leaders and local solutions and invested and supported them. And so one of the things that really interests me is how do we do that better here in the US? How do we invest, but we invest in local leadership, we invest in local solutions, and we invest in the interdependence that's really necessary. So the other thing is, the other part of my career is on sustainable development. And let me tell you that if we're going to make a clean energy transition in this country, rural America is at the center and at the heart of it. Yeah. That's where wind farms, solar, mining, manufacturing, all of that is going to take place in rural. I mean, to green our energy, even if you look at the low end of that energy mix as solar and wind, wind farms that would be the equivalent of Indiana and Illinois combined. Each of those, think of all the towns in those states. Each of those towns spread out across the US are going to have to make decisions around trade-offs about how that's going to affect their community, how those benefits are shared, how it sustains their community. And that's what's going to power our country. It's what's going to power our cities. If you're in a city you depend on rural for so much to make that city a vibrant, living place. So that's what brings me to this.
Well, and there's no doubt about it, and maybe we can get into this later, but I think frequently people think, oh, when they think rural, they think that's all agriculture. About 30% of the biggest economic driver in rural America is extraction. It's energy. And this transition is part of that dialogue about how do you transition workers who have done this for years and years, whether it's in the mine, whether it is oil drilling, how do you begin to talk about that next energy development? But I want to turn to you, Secretary, and maybe just start out with your history of representing rural America, how you got to USDA, and her career has skyrocketed, so they know how to choose talent over there. But some of the things that you've taken from your district and the work that you've done in rural New Mexico and brought them to Washington, both first in Congress and then in USDA.
Thank you so much, Heidi. It's a joy and an honor to get to be here. And Tony, as you were speaking, I was thinking about our shared experience with international development. Mm-hmm. You have much greater experience there. But so I'll start a little bit earlier. I was born in the Mesilla Valley, or I grew up in the Mesilla Valley in Las Cruces, New Mexico, which is a small city, and spent summers in my aunt and uncle's ranch in Colorado. And wanted to just get as far away as possible, because even in a small city, everybody knows everyone, and I felt a little trapped. And so I got to spend the last year of high school in Southern Africa, and then decided I wanted to do international development. So in college, I was studying international development, and I had this really great class. The first half was international development, the second half was poverty in the United States. And what we learned from international development side was, if you really want to make change, you invest in local leadership. You invest in those local solutions. And then in the second half of the conversation or the class, I learned that I was reminded just how far my own home had to go. It was a persistent poverty county right along the U.S.-Mexico border. And so it made me think maybe instead of traveling thousands of miles away, I should travel back home. And also, during that time, I realized how homesick I was, how much I actually loved my home. So then I got the chance to represent it in Congress, and getting to know your home as the representative is a unique challenge, because things might you might go to a community, you feel like everything's beautiful, right? The rural places that you might visit if you're a tourist going skiing, for example. But then when you're trying to work with that community to apply for a grant, and there's no grant writer, maybe there's a half-time clerk. Or if you're visiting with the hospital and in the middle of a pandemic, they are on the brink of closure. And those are the economies of scale type challenges. Those are the things that rural people navigate every single day to be able to continue to live in the place they love. So getting to work now at USDA and investing in that local leadership, trying to retool programs so that we can do that, taking these historic investments from the Biden-Harris administration and saying, how can we make sure they're really impacting farmers on the ground, small and mid-sized farmers? That's the opportunity. And I'll always be reminded that it's about empowering that local expertise.
Amazing. There are very few politicians in America that everybody likes. Trust me, that me included. Everybody loves Governor Ducey, in part because he listens, in part because he leads when it's important to lead, but because he sees America optimistically. And Governor, you have a really unique state in that, I think what percentage of the population, if you could tell people, percentage of the population that you have in Arizona that is in the Phoenix metro area, then compared to the rest of the state, has only 9 counties. So you have fewer local governments to kind of help go through this work. But you have to represent all of them. And the theme of what we're trying to talk about right now in this panel is we all need each other. So how did you convince the people in Metro Phoenix that they needed rural Arizona and vice versa? How did you bridge those gaps when you were governor?
Well, thank you, Heidi. I mean, it's great to be back at the University of Chicago. David, thanks for what you created here.
We just have to have a moment to shout out to David Axelrod, our fearless founder. And little did he know when he started the Bridging the Divide, we would explode it this way. But this, as I told the students yesterday, this is really a huge legacy of yours, David, recognizing this. And we're incredibly grateful for your leadership. Well, I wouldn't be here without this project. You know that. This is our combined passion. So you'll hear from David when we talk about media this afternoon. But you can.
And I think you know this, Heidi, because you did it so well in North Dakota, is part of running for office is getting in front of the people. And I was somewhat naive when I ran for office. I came from the private sector. My company was Cold Stone Creamery, the ice cream business. And I think your penance, if you decide to run for election, is 50% of the people immediately don't like you as soon as you register your party registration. And that was.
But everybody loves Cold Stone, right? So you had that going for you.
It was a good calling card. And so in Arizona, if you simplify it, we have Phoenix, which is Maricopa County. That's 65% of the state, and it's red trending purple. You have Tucson, which is Pima County. That's 15% of the state. So you have 20% of the state in the two largest cities, and then 15 counties total throughout the state. And those 13 outside of the two major metropolitan areas don't have more than 3% of the population. And if you think of it from a partisan standpoint, outside of the metro areas, deep red, Tucson, pretty blue, and Maricopa's been a coin flip for some time. I've always thought the better candidate and the better campaign wins Maricopa, and if you can do that, you can lead the state. So for me, so much of this is us sitting down together and getting in these rooms and really spending time, not only on the campaign trail in which you demonstrate how you'll govern if you were to be successful, but then once you do have the ability to make those decisions. So the idea is I wanted to help grow our economy. I didn't understand why companies were going to places like California and Texas and flying right over Arizona. And I wanted rural Arizona to be able to participate in some of the prosperity. They were eager to do that, but they also had some different needs. They had real concerns around issues like water and the border and healthcare, education, and access to capital. And if you don't address those things proactively, you're never going to be able to talk to them about the things that you want to move forward. And one of the things that we were able to do in terms of leveling the playing field, because the thing is, I know people here have spent time in rural America. They don't want to move to the city. They don't aspire to come to Chicago or Phoenix. Sometimes they do, but most of the time, the folks I'm talking to don't want to live in Scottsdale. They're just fine in Mojave County, and they don't like when they are categorized in a certain way. They sometimes, I think, feel talked down to by Washington, D.C., and by folks that don't come and visit them. So I do think meeting them where they are, addressing the issues that are on their mind. And I was somewhat fortunate because we did build ice cream stores in rural areas. It's not the same capital formation that a high-tech company would bring. But one thing you do see in rural areas are quick service restaurants, our franchise opportunities. Those aren't only opportunities for entrepreneurs there, but they also create jobs and a lot of good entry-level jobs.
Well, and they make people feel like they have amenities. I used to say, we had probably about 30 good primary sector jobs in Grafton, North Dakota. And you think, that's you, Doug.
Yep.
30 great primary sector jobs. I said, but if they can't stream Netflix, now that shows how old I was at the time, then they're not coming there. And so that's how it looks and whether they feel like they're part of something. So let's talk about specific issues, because I know there's a fair number of people in this audience who are interested in healthcare and delivering healthcare. And one of the greatest challenges that we have right now in rural America is the disparity between access to healthcare in rural America or access to healthcare in urban America. You know, the barriers have always been economic before, but now the barriers are becoming space and time. Even in North Dakota, where we have a fairly robust system, we still see you might have to drive 70, 80 miles in labor to deliver a child. And so people are, people just say, I can't do that. So I think, Secretary, I'm going to start with you, talking about healthcare, because the Secretary also was the head of rural development for a while, and this is a key component. And I want you to address, because we're going to have a panel later on about opioids and the challenges, but I want you to address maybe some strategies that you guys are pursuing at USDA to try and build a rural healthcare system that meets the needs of people in the entire state and the communities.
You know, when I was a representative, I met a woman who had that experience you described. She had complications in her pregnancy and wasn't able to make it to the hospital in time and ended up delivering on the side of the road. And one, it's just hard to be from a community that you are choosing to live in and love and know that your kids won't be born there, right? That's just a hard concept. That's not really fair. But then two, you also don't know if you're going to get the health care that you need to bring your child into the world safely. And in digging into the issue, one of the things that I've learned is that each hospital system is really complex. And there might be one answer for one hospital system. They're having trouble with workforce, for example. There's lots, that's a common challenge, but it's often the answers are quite unique. And so it's about finding out how to support them. So one of the things that rural development did with the investment through the rescue plan was that we invested in technical assistance to go to hospitals and say, let's look at your stream and how are you able to pencil out your operations? And providing that assistance was really crucial, because then it helped provide a strategy for where are the places where we might be able to go and pursue a grant from rural development, for example. Another thing specifically with maternal mortality and morbidity is working interdepartmentally. So one of the challenges with hospitals, right, maybe they're trying to get a grant from rural development, they're trying to get better internet so they can do more telehealth, and so they're having to work with NTIA and USDA and a whole bunch of other acronyms. And then they also, of course, are always working with HHS, with Health and Human Services. So USDA, working with the White House, established the Rural Partners Network and identified key communities that both experience challenges but also have a really robust leadership network, and asked them, what are the things you most want to focus on? And a few of them, one of them in Arizona actually, mentioned that healthcare, and specifically maternal mortality and morbidity, was one of their biggest challenges. And so now they're partnering with HHS to do research on how they can better combat some of those challenges. And so to make sure that the people in the rural community are the ones who get to help ask the questions is a fundamental part of finding the solution.
And we keep going back to that key word, leadership. That leadership and letting people tell you what their needs are. Tony, when you look at kind of the demographic changes and what's happening in rural America, how concerned are you about access to healthcare as a driver in the demographics?
Well, I'm very concerned about it, and I think most rural communities that are looking towards their future and how they continue to thrive, they're focused on quality of life as a way of creating that resilience for whatever might happen economically, right? If you've got a certain level of quality of life, you're leveraging the natural assets that you might have that make it attractive. You're leveraging the community spirit that the Undersecretary was talking about. But you want to be able to deliver like the basic level of services as well at a really high quality. So that's health, that's education, that's infrastructure, it's broadband as well. And Deputy Secretary just mentioned broadband for telehealth, right? That's going to be really, really important. I think the other thing to keep in mind is when you're in a rural community, you might be one person playing many different roles, right? So you might be on the hospital.
The principal is the bus driver.
Right.
We know that. Yeah.
I mean, you might be on the hospital board at the same time as you're serving as the town supervisor, at the same time as you're on your church's, council as well. And so, as she was talking, that customization of solution is real. There are different regional markets, regional economies. There are different sets of regional assets. There's even differences in human capital in places. So solutions that look to sustain communities for the future are different. They're based on different histories as well and the legacy of those histories. But the civic capacity that we have to be able to take all that into account, access the capital, whether it's public or private, to make it happen, can be really constrained in rural places. And so investing in that civic capacity, you've got many times volunteer elected officials, many times very thinly staffed city halls. And so ensuring that we have the civic capacity to be able to deliver the healthcare, to be able to access the public resources that are available maybe to help you with that healthcare that USDA provides or that others provide within the federal government. I think that's really important. We need to make investments up front in local communities and their civic capacity and their civic collaboration that will really unleash more resources to do the things like bring healthcare and make sure it's there for people.
Yeah, Governor, I want to just add a little nuance. There are students here, some from urban areas, but many from rural areas, make a pitch that they should run for mayor of Carrington, North Dakota. Make a pitch.
Well, what I would say is if you want to make a difference, you'll get no bigger opportunity than when you get ball control in office. But I always tell young people, go do something else with your life first. Become a subject matter expert in something, build a business, turn a school around, join the military, then run for office. Because there's so much between, it's not really the skill of being elected and reelected, it's what you can do once you're elected.
One of the challenges, and there's a recent news story about, because of the political divide, and we haven't really hit that yet, the perceived political divide that we talked about yesterday in the panel, there are people who are opting out of running for office, of taking leadership positions. So what you're hearing here is how important leadership is, but yet, because of the toxicity of our political environment, people are saying, I'm not even running for the library board, right? So I mean, the thing is, how do you get people to see themselves in leadership and be resilient enough in this toxic political environment to step up and actually lead? I mean, you've done well. I mean, you've taken slings and arrows from both sides, Governor. And so I think that's a good launching pad for advice here.
It's kind of an Arizona tradition, isn't it, to take slings and arrows from both sides? But I think my experience on this stage in this conversation is much closer to what it's like to be a governor and to do the local leadership and at the state level. I don't think we're as divided as everyone says. I've been out of office now nearly 2 years, and I don't think there's a better focus group than Southwest Airlines or American Airlines Flying Coach. People from all over our country travel, and I just don't see the divide that I see on cable nightly news, not the divide that I see in the national parties, which most of the energy is on the extremes. You very rarely are going to see two governors on split screen nightly news yelling at each other unless they're running for president. We all have problems to solve. Governors are chief executive officers of their own state. They might see it from a different view. Some might have more faith in the government, and some might have more faith in the private sector or local communities. But we're trying to address these problems. And I think if we go into rural America, and Tony, what you said I think is so true, it is market customization. Because I hear about the discussion around these rural hospitals all over the nation, but imagine in Arizona, in Yuma, on the border, where over the course of a month, you can have the size of your city population double. Well, these folks that are coming across the border have the same health issues of the people that are already living in Yuma. So uncompensated care, working with state government and federal government on how to address that is a very unique issue in the South in Arizona. And it's one that dominates the conversation.
Governor, you would also agree that we heard a presentation about how people perceive that somebody's getting something I'm not getting. That's a real issue, so one of the challenges that you have is convincing someone that is in their benefit for everybody to have access to health care because they see somebody's getting something they're not getting. And so, I want you just to comment about how do you bridge that perception gap that that divides us in ways that shouldn't divide us?
Well, first, Heidi, I would not play that game in terms of how we divvy these things up. I look at it in terms of problem, solution, or issue and policy to address it. And I wanted to be governor of all the people. And I'm sitting in front of a person in rural Arizona or a person in downtown Phoenix.
But does everybody in Arizona think that you should be governor of all the people, including the people coming across the border?
Well, I would no, and I would not present myself that way either. I don't think people should be coming across the border. Yeah. And I've been quite outspoken on that. The border can be secured. It has never been perfect, but it has been much more stable than it is right now. It is in crisis. And this wreaks havoc in rural Arizona. So I have to address the needs of the citizens of Arizona, and I have to also address the reality of what's happening on the ground.
Yeah, I think that bridges me into the cultural divide, because what you will hear frequently is that, yes, we all want good health care, we want good education, we want we want economic opportunity, but what really divides us, urban, rural, is a cultural sense. It's as people have famously said, guns, gods, and gays, right? How do you see that issue, Tony, the cultural issues as part of the toxicity of the challenges that we have today bringing people together, urban, rural?
Yeah, so I think it's a real thing, and it goes back to even the conversation we were having last night around narrative. One thing I would tell, a friend of mine in New York City is that whatever picture you have in your mind of rural, when you say rural, what comes, that picture is likely to be 1/10 of the diversity, and that is racial, that is economic, that is geographic in rural America. And even the narratives that we have that rural places are struggling, we're in this, place of decline, I think undermines the fact that in many rural communities, even rural communities that might be economically struggling, there is progress, there are positive things happening, there are leaders who are bridging divides locally to actually make those things happening. I've got a podcast, I go out and I visit small towns across the US where positive change is happening. And what's really interesting to me from both this cultural and political divide is that when people are focused on the issues in their community and seeking to solve those problems, that national politics fritters away. Like, nationalization of politics has done us no good, I would say personally, at the local level. But if you can stay focused on what do we need to do to be a healthy community, I've seen that bridge over what narratives we have in Washington, D.C. about how things are divided. But there is a perspective, and I think it is because we don't have many relationships that traverse urban and rural now. We don't have many personal relationships. Sarah Smarsh last night, I thought, put it very well. If you're a rural person, you might go to a city on a regular basis for different things, even to fly out or just to shop or whatever.
Or to watch the Vikings.
Well, okay. Okay, well. We might talk about
yeah.
football
We won't talk
team.
about the Eagles.
But if you're in a city, you might not often have the opportunity or the impulse to go to a rural place, and we have and that means that people make assumptions about what people value. From my perspective, as I'm traveling to rural towns, what people really value is their community. They hold that as a really high value. You can even see that in the political polling that we talk about and that we look at. They're really worried about the health of their community, and they're voting around that. And I think the thing that we need to understand is they don't feel as if their community is in control of their own destiny all the time. And that, I think, is the cultural divide. We're not recognizing that, that rural communities don't always feel as if they're able to buffet the large forces that are coming in from the outside. And I think if we can find ways in which more people get out to rural America, work in rural America, even if it's on a temporary basis, more youth going out and doing service in rural America, I think we'll be able to start to reweave some of those broken relationships.
If I can add to that, because it's such a great example where our concept of values that aren't aligned is different from the reality. So a lot of time people will say, oh, rural is ruggedly independent. And being from the West, being from New Mexico, I will agree there is a beautiful independent just sense. But at the same time, there is no place that cares more about their neighbor. Mm-hmm. When I was Undersecretary for Rural Development, I would have this mental game where I knew I was in the right place. I knew I really was in a rural place if, one, I was talking to someone who, depending on the time of the day, was wearing 5, 6, 7 hats, one of their 5, 6, or 7 hats. They were that church board leader and the local mayor and the bank owner, right? They were all of those things. So that's one thing. All of those are because they care about their community, because they see needs and they are signing up to fill it. Then the other is, if there's a restaurant, which there isn't always, I know that when I go into that restaurant, I'll see pictures of local sports teams. I'll see a kids 4-H club. I'll see how much that restaurant, which it's hard to make money in a rural restaurant, is investing in their young people. And so it's a misconception about rural America that always bothers me because they care so much about their community.
I would also say it's not monolithic. I mean, in Arizona, our rural areas are by and large thriving. The state is thriving economically. We've got a lot of growth, and as you drive growth into Phoenix and into Tucson, it cascades. I mean, good things happen in Prescott and Payson. We do have some struggles in the South, on the border, but I think this idea of, I talk a lot about showing up, and it's one great thing about being governor. You know, you can get out there, you can spend the day, and you can still be home by dinner at 7 p.m. But boy, you come back a lot smarter. And there is a certain chip on the shoulder because they've been lumped into a basket of deplorables. And no one wants to hear that, or values have been assaulted, like a real commitment to the Second Amendment, or the fact that religious faith leads a lot of these meetings. And I think just a demonstration of respect for the values that are there goes a long way. And I'll give one example where I had to change hearts and minds in rural America, and a lot of Republicans don't have to do that, but I really believed in school choice, and I knew what was happening in some of the tougher parts of the bigger cities, and a lot of these kids were trapped in failing public schools, and I thought if we got them an educational savings account, they could go where they wanted, but we had to get that through the state legislature. And in Arizona, when the rural guys show up down at the state legislature, everybody knows it, and it's normally around water issues. Well, oftentimes in our rural areas, these school districts are the largest employers. And there was a lot of fear that if we had school choice, it would affect them from an employment perspective. So it took all of 8 years to get these votes. Now that we've passed this in Arizona, 11 other states have followed suit. But talking to your rural communities about some things that they don't want to hear is just part of the leadership and governance duty if you really want to affect policy and make change. And I think we can do it, and I think we should convene and bring folks together more often. I know the guy that's the principal and the school bus driver, but there's also many of these communities where these leaders have been there quite a while. There's a new generation coming in, and like I said, they aren't looking forward to moving to the city. They want to know that they're going to have the water and the power and the health care and the broadband so that they can continue to grow and thrive.
Yeah, there's a publication that's gotten a lot of attention, White Rural Rage, right? It feeds into this stereotype that these are not people to be trusted. They believe in conspiracy theories. They're out. They are super hyper judgmental about urban America. And one of the things that I always say when people say, I go to a rural community and they say, we're the real America. What does that mean? We're the real America. I mean, we're all Americans. And I always remind people that prejudice and stereotypes go two ways, right? That this idea that, and I think Rhymefest yesterday talked a lot about, visiting with people in Wyoming who were convinced that if you walked 2 steps into Chicago, you're going to get shot, right? So the myth, the myths go both ways. Mm-hmm. So I guess how do we break down those barriers, those easy stereotypes that so often get fanned in, whether it's all of America's white, all of America is, or all of rural America's white, all of rural America's racist, all of rural America is poor, right, and uneducated. But on the other side, all of urban America is crime infested. It is a cesspool of no values, no families. Apparently people aren't raised in families in urban America. If you listen to some of my friends who have perceptions about what happens, these are challenges, and that's really what we're talking about today, which is how do we get people to be interconnected, to see themselves first not as an urban American or a rural American, but as an American. How do we, other than preaching to the choir, which is what we're doing today, how do we break down those barriers?
It's one of the reasons why I love working for USDA, because a clear thing that unites all of us is that we all eat. And that means that we depend on, thank you, yeah, stating the obvious, right? But it means that we depend on each other. It means that we depend on farmers. It also means that we depend on the food system, what's the transportation system that's sending the food, that the grocery store, all of those things. And it's a great place to look for what do we need to learn from each other. I was in Fort Worth, Texas, and talking with a farmer, an urban ag farmer, who was working to set up a CSA, a community-supported agriculture. So he was working with other urban farmers because the reality is that economies of scale is really important when you set up local food systems. So they need lots of food. But they were struggling because these were all first-time farmers and they didn't have all of the best skills when it came to growing food. So he ended up reaching out to more conventional farmers in the area and learning from them, who had much more experience growing food, but were having trouble accessing a higher value local market in an urban area. And so by learning from each other, urban farmers who needed a mentor when it came to agriculture, and more traditional farmers who needed access to a market and maybe some savvy on marketing via TikTok, it created this opportunity where we could work together.
So I think we need to create opportunities to create this exchange. I was in Nebraska a few weeks ago with the Nebraska Community Foundation, which has, does its philanthropy all over the state. And they were challenged in seeing these cultural misperceptions and preconceptions. And so created an opportunity, started a conversation, created an opportunity for folks from inner city Omaha to take a bus out to McCook County, Nebraska, and vice versa, and just talk about what they're trying to do in their communities. What are the problems that they're facing? What are the challenges? What are the opportunities they're facing? How are they trying to take advantage of it? And saw a lot of similarities in what they're both facing and in what the solutions are that they're facing. And I have to say also, we've seen, and I'll take a little page from my international development book, one of the things that helped us understand what was really going on in developing countries overseas was the Peace Corps, where we sent people into countries and had experiences in providing and working alongside local communities. Where we're starting to see some innovations with people who are even in the audience of doing that for youth here. Lead for America, the American Connection Corps, where young people will go and have a fellowship in a hometown and help with the civic capacity in that hometown for broadband and other things. The American Exchange Project, where high school seniors spend a week in another hometown that's not their own so that they get to experience that. I think we need to do these things more. And I think actually faith communities and the network of faith communities, we could be doing this in a large way if we put our mind to it.
Governor, I'm going to give you the last word, and then we're going to go to questions. And as typical for the University of Chicago, students first in terms of questioning. That includes all the students here.
Well, I think this idea of as simple as that is incredibly effective. The folks that I see that are most active politically across the state are not always the ones that are most active as public servants in these communities.
They aren't the most active in bridging the divide. Is that what you're saying?
Well, but the people that will bridge the divide are there, and they're often doing a lot of work in that community. Now, this is our system. We embrace it, and you have to navigate it, because if you don't get into the office, you can't affect the policy. But I do think the good news is that you can address these issues and you can cross this divide. I see it as much less divided on the ground than as you see it in the air.
We have to create a system that gets those leaders to feel comfortable stepping up. And it has to be a generational change, because the greatest generation isn't there anymore, and every generation behind feels less invested in that kind of community leadership. And that's why we're doing this program. So we're going to open it up to questions. Students, there you go. There's 2 microphones. Head to the microphone. You can ask anything you want. We give preference to students first.
Hello, I'm Jack Honig. I'm from the University of Chicago. I have a question for Secretary Torres Small. I live in northern New Mexico, in Santa Fe. And in Santa Fe, you see a pretty thriving economy. But if you travel 45 minutes north, right, you get to towns like Chimayo and Espanola, and these are rural towns that don't have the business opportunities that you get in big cities. And in talking with a bunch of state heads for the U.S. Rural Development Agency, you see that a lot of the IRA money that goes, the Inflation Reduction Act money, that comes into the U.S. Rural Development Agency's business programs, about 50% of that money ends up being geared towards clean energy. And in a lot of these poorer towns, they don't have the human capital for to have the skills to really establish these giant clean energy production facilities. It's why you see in New Mexico the large solar farms are being built right outside of.
So we need a question, because we're getting a line up. So yep, that's okay.
Do you think this is the right approach to be bringing in IRA money, a lot of it for clean energy, as opposed to other business ventures?
I'd love to talk with you afterwards because I'm not sure, I don't think that your facts are completely right on this, having supervised rural development. So one of the programs I think you're probably talking about is the Rural Energy for America program, but that includes energy efficiency. And I've seen lots of projects used in rural towns for grocery stores, for example, so they can cut down their costs for energy with more efficiency. So it's, even though you might see it as clean energy, it's about efficiency. Also, there has been an investment in production of energy and clean energy because we recognize there will be energy production that might be displaced when it comes to oil and gas, for example, and making sure that rural communities still have investment in that. But there's also been a huge investment in farming practices. And that's where most of the energy investments have actually happened, supporting rural farmers so they can finally get recognized for a lot of practices they've been doing for a really long time.
We have a lot of people lined up, and so we need to make sure that we get to the question pretty quickly. We're over here.
Alrighty. Hi folks, my name is Tyler. I'm from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and for context, I'm from Marshfield, Wisconsin originally, which if anybody in here knows where that is, I will be very, very impressed. Oh, perfect, okay. But so one of the things I've seen both as a student reporter and as someone from a rural area is especially since the mid-2010s. We've had a lack of news coverage in local areas, which has seen a lot of folks turn to national news. But we've also seen a ratcheting up.
I'm going to just get to your question.
Yeah, no, thank you. And this is for both yourself as well as Governor Ducey. We've seen a ratcheting up of partisan rhetoric, specifically from the far right. And you guys have touched on, rural folks, white rural rage, folks having conceived stereotypes. But what role do you think political rhetoric, especially knowing that there are news deserts in rural communities, plays in that? Plays in those beliefs coming from rural areas or those perspectives?
Go ahead, Heidi.
I think it's huge. I think when the only thing that you get is your feed on your Facebook page, and it's a post that is disinformation or it says something outrageous. And I think all the time about how do we build resiliency, not to ignore those because people have the right to, free speech, but how do we make people more skeptical of what they see? How do we make people think, how does that make me feel as someone from this community when we're using that kind of language about another human being? And so this didn't happen overnight, and I know that a lot of people want to blame the former president, but this was happening over a long period of time. And how we get to a broader community respectful standard and fact-based information is a real challenge, and I'm hoping that's exactly what David Axelrod and his panel will solve this afternoon. So tune in. There will be a great panel about that.
And I'd push back a little bit and say, there's an extreme right and an extreme left, and it's probably the biggest difference I've seen since entering public life. In 2014, there seemed to be a great wrestling match between the conservative right and the liberal left, and we settle and compromise and move on to what the next issue is. Because the energy is in the extremes, nothing is getting done right now. Many people have unplugged, and my concern, and I'm thrilled to see so many people in the room, is that young people have just unplugged, oftentimes don't have cable TV, get their news and information a different way. But it's not just in the rural areas. I mean, who is covering the Peoria City Council? Who is covering the Surprise City Council? I mean, around Phoenix, you have dozens of municipalities with literally no coverage. The Arizona Republic at one point had 13 people that covered the state legislature and the governor. Today's there's one.
Yeah. I thought Sarah did such a nice job yesterday kind of talking about how the loss of that person covering the local ball game has really affected how we see each other. We're going to go over there.
Hi, my name is Jade Zhang. I'm a student from Washington University in St. Louis, and I guess my question is directed mainly to Governor Ducey, but also all of the people with policy experience here. So you guys all mentioned how you think that we're actually less divided than we seem in our country, but recently there's been many policies and legislation that have been passed, like the Arizona Supreme Court ruling this past week, that are broadly unpopular with people across America. And I'm from a rural area, and there's still like pretty broad support for maternal health care and reproductive rights. So what do you guys think should be done in that regards, like with policies not reflecting the needs of the people?
A good question.
Jay, I think it's a very timely question, and I think it's a real challenge to what we believe our democracy is. We saw what happened in Arizona 2 days ago. The law that was overturned or decided against was a law that I signed in my last year in the governor's office. It was the 15-week law. It was done with not a lot of fanfare. It was considered conservative at the time, and it was before the United States Supreme Court made its ruling on Dobbs that overturned Roe. Our mindset was that the law was the 15-week law. That was challenged, elevated through the courts, and decided the day before yesterday that the law that superseded it was the territorial law, a law written in 1865. So I'll respect the judiciary's decision. And now this comes to the people or to the legislature. The legislature has the ability to act on this right now. And there's a lot of discussion on taking away or rescinding the territorial law. And that would put in place the 15-week law, and there would be clarity. I think that you're either going to see that happen in Arizona in the next several weeks, or you're going to see a ballot initiative that will be on the ballot in November. But I think I would think you'll see action on that in the next week or so.
Yeah, Tony, you want to comment?
I think the comment I would also say, and it's even implicit in your question in talking about the support in rural areas for maternal health, is there is a political divide in this country. And to Governor Ducey's point, it's at the extremes as well. But we often point it as a rural-urban divide. It's not necessarily that, right? I think what Nick and Dan even showed last night is what we often think of as a rural-urban divide is actually a political divide, and it's happening as much in the cities and the suburbs as it's happening in between rural and urban. And so we have to be very careful about looking for the boogeyman where it may not be, and looking for the ways in which we create the coalitions that could exist, but we need to get past these preconceptions of it being a division between rural and urban.
And I think those of us that have a label, which is Republican or Democrat, should also pay attention that the fastest growing affiliation is non-affiliated or independent.
Exactly, right.
And thank you so much for your question, very timely. Over here.
Hi, my name's Emma Feldmeyer. I'm also from Washington University in St. Louis, and my question also has to do with women's health care and women's reproductive rights, and especially access to that in rural areas. So my question is, how do we reduce maternal mortality rates that are probably rising in like a post-rural world, since people don't really have access to health care as much in rural areas after the Dobbs decision?
Thank you, great question.
Sure. So one of the key things that in rural development through recent investments was the bipartisan infrastructure law that invested in expanding access to high-speed internet. And one of the places where we saw the most desire for that was in hospitals and in medical units so that they can provide telehealth medicine. Because when it comes to rural healthcare, when you're talking about maternal mortality and morbidity, that early care is so important. But it's often about monitoring, right? So it's a woman who's able to take her vitals and send them to her doctor to make sure things are going well. So finding new ways to provide access and information to a woman so that she can make the best choices for herself is a crucial part of that. And part of that is just increasing communication as well with the doctor.
I want to just take a point of privilege. A lot of what's happening right now in rural America is workforce. And when workforce doesn't think that they can provide quality health care, they aren't going to work there. And so that Idaho is finding that out. And so these are going to be huge challenges for people who see, morally that abortion is wrong. The legislature reflects that view, passes very extreme legislation, it has huge consequences. And I think just now we're starting to realize those. We will see policy changes. I think Arizona is a great example. You saw the reaction in Georgia. We're going to see policy reaction. But in the meantime, the risk to women's health is real. And so thank you for your question. I'm going to go over here. We have time for maybe 2 more questions. So please, a question very quickly.
Yes, ma'am. My name is Manar Fajors. I'm a student at the University of Chicago. And right now, we see at least an effort to revitalize manufacturing in these rural communities as the drain of manufacturing in the 80s and 90s led to a lot of economic problems and social problems, cultural problems. So do you believe that this policy effort to revitalizing manufacturing is going to help these areas? And do you think America can compete with China and emerging markets who have cheap labor and have better actually manufacturing infrastructure than the United States?
Okay. Want to take Tony?
Sure. I think there's a lot of new opportunity coming to rural America in terms of manufacturing. Some of that's in the clean energy economy. Some of it's through the CHIPS and Science Act and semiconductor manufacturing. 2 things I would say about that. One is we need to make sure that it's not just happening to these rural communities, but with these rural communities. And that rural communities are in the driver's seat of figuring out how to actually ensure that the revenues that could sustain them as a town, the quality of life things that we're talking about, broadband, healthcare, those things, are not incentivized away, but are actually creating something sustaining going forward. But it also gets to, Heidi, what you were just talking about around workforce development and human capital investment. And we want to make sure that we're not just continuing to create mono-economies, and by investing both in workforce to fill those manufacturing jobs, but also create an ecosystem around it of local businesses and local suppliers. And downtowns, I think, is really important. It's got to be a both and. The manufacturing plant alone is not going to be the thing to save the town, but it's got to be the town in conjunction with it and investments both in workforce and otherwise.
Well, we've come to the end of our time. I want to just comment, because we haven't talked enough about Native issues. And for our states, Native populations are a huge part of the fabric of rural America. And I want to just kind of mention on manufacturing and this need to build human capacity or human capital. For years, the idea of what you were going to do to bring jobs to a reservation was put up a plant, a manufacturing plant, usually a defense plant. No one asked the people if they wanted to work there, right? That was just where you're going to go. And so this idea of building capacity and entrepreneurship and leader and letting the community lead and because that's the only way you're going to be successful. So I wanted you all to thank my panel. Terrific job. Thank you. Thank you.